The sensor array did not malfunction. That was the first thing Commander Varric checked. He ran the diagnostic sequence twice, then a third time because the option where the numbers were correct, was not something he was ready to sit with yet. The numbers were correct. Varric had commanded the Tassari scout vessel, Desh Mora, for 9 years. He had patrolled the quarantine fringe for 6 of those years. He knew what the fringe looked like on sensors. Dead space, cold rock, the occasional ghost signal from some pre-Accord debris field. He knew what did not belong here. This belonged nowhere. The object sat at 4.2 million kilometers, bearing 274 on a flat vector toward the inner fringe boundary. Hull mass consistent with a midweight dreadnought, moving at 0.3 light speed. Oh, no thermal signature, no drive exhaust, no gravitational bow wake, which was impossible because mass moving at 0.3 light pulled space behind it like a hand dragging through water. You could not have mass without the wake. That was not a rule Tassari engineers had invented. That was a rule the universe had written before any Tassari had existed to read it. The object had no wake, no heat, no electromagnetic signature of any kind, which meant no active systems, no passive systems, no leakage from power generation, nothing. A dreadnought mass object needed a power source roughly equivalent to a small star just to maintain internal atmosphere. This thing was putting out less detectable energy than a cold rock, and it was moving at 0.3 light in complete silence. Varric stood very still at the command console and looked at the readout for a long time. Behind him, he could hear his crew doing the same. That particular quality of silence that fell over a bridge when everyone understood something was wrong and nobody wanted to be the first one to say it out loud. Senior Sensor Officer Preth spoke first. "Sir, hull material classification." "What is it?" Preth's voice was flat in a way that took effort. "The system returned unknown. Not unclassified, not exotic, not restricted database. The Tassari sensor taxonomy had 14,000 material categories. It could identify hull composites from 60 dead civilizations. It could distinguish between 47 grades of compressed dark matter alloy. It had categories for things that had not been manufactured in 3 centuries. Unknown." A Varric pulled up the raw material scan on his own console. The sensor beam had hit the hull, bounced back, and the analysis system had processed the return data for 0.4 of a second, an eternity for a computer, before returning that single word. Not "we don't know what this is," more like, "this does not fit into any system for knowing things." He stared at it. Then he pulled up the hull geometry scan. The geometry scan was worse. A standard vessel existed in 3 spatial dimensions: length, width, height. You could map it, you could model it. What the scan returned on the human ship was a shape that, depending on the angle of measurement, appeared to occupy 3 dimensions, or 4, or sometimes a number the computer expressed as a question mark because it had no numerical value for the result. And the ship's shape changed based on how you looked at it. Varric set down the console stylus, picked it up again, set it down. His physicist, Drain, appeared at his shoulder. She had been on the bridge for 4 minutes and had not said a single word, which was not like her. Drain had opinions about everything and generally shared them without invitation. She stood beside him with her arms crossed tight over her chest, looking at the geometry scan. "Dran, sir, talk to me." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the viewport, there was nothing to see. The human ship was too far for visual. Just stars. Just the ordinary dark. "The hull is reading as older than the ship," Dran said. Varric turned to look at her. "That sentence does not mean anything?" "No," Drain agreed. "Tarya doesn't." She pulled up her own console and showed him a temporal resonance scan, the kind of passive read that could estimate a material's age based on particle decay at the quantum level. The kind of reading you took from ancient ruins when you wanted to date them without touching them. The hull returned in age. The ship's recorded construction date, pulled from thin, old Tassari intelligence files on human vessels, was 41 years ago. The hull's particle resonance said approximately 900 years. Drain did not offer an explanation. She showed him the numbers, closed her console, and went back to her station without another word. Varric thought about what to do. And the Silence Accords had been negotiated 50 years ago after what the broader galaxy called the expansion period and what humans apparently called a Tuesday. The Accords created the Quarantine Fringe, a buffer zone, 3 light-years deep, wrapped around human space. No Tasari vessel crossed it without explicit council authorization. No human vessel was supposed to cross outward without the same. The human ship had crossed it. It was in Tasari-patrolled space, moving calmly, steadily, without any acknowledgement of the Fringe or the Accords or the Tasari vessel, sitting 4.2 million kilometers away staring at it. Protocol required a hail. Varric Sol hailed on 17 frequencies, the full Tasari standard range. He transmitted the Accord's identification codes, the patrol vessel registry, the standard first contact greeting that every spacefaring species recognized on sight. He waited. The human ship did not respond. Not static, not a signal return that said received, stand by. The transmission left the Deshmora, crossed 4.2 million kilometers, and arrived at the human ship's hull, and stopped. Preth ran the transmission trace 3 times. The signal reached the hull. The hull absorbed it. No reflection, no echo, no return signal of any kind. Like hailing a wall. "Sir," said Navigation Officer Tank very carefully, "the object's vector. If maintained, it's headed for the Orath system." Varric Sol knew Orath. Everyone on this patrol route knew Orath. A Tasari research station. 12,000 researchers. Settled in a quiet system just inside the Fringe boundary for the last 30 years. Not a military target. Not strategically significant. A collection of scientists studying deep space particle behavior, directly in the human ship's path. Distance to Orath at current vector and speed? 11 hours, 14 minutes. Varric Sol breathed in, breathed out. The Tasari approach to conflict was structured. 16 stages of engagement escalation, each with defined protocols, each requiring specific authorizations from specific levels of command. You did not skip stages. The structure existed precisely for moments like this one, when something appeared in the Fringe and made everyone's hands want to act before their heads gave permission. He would follow the structure. He opened a priority channel to Hegemony Command. While he waited for the connection, 4 minutes at this distance for the signal, but 8 minutes total for reply. He watched the human ship on sensors. It did not slow down. It did not speed up. It held its vector with a steadiness that was almost meditative, like it knew exactly where it was going and had known for a long time and felt no particular anxiety about arriving. The command channel opened. Varric Sol gave his report in flat, clipped language. Just the facts, just the readings. Nothing added that was not a measurement or an observation. Mass, vector, material classification, geometry anomaly, hull age discrepancy, absorbed transmissions. He did not say what he felt, which was something old and cold sitting at the base of his throat, but something his species called the deep recognition response. The biological alarm that fired when the brain encountered something that did not fit into any category the species had survived before. He sent the report. He waited. He watched the ship. On his secondary console, passive sensors were still running. He pulled up the latest return. One new detail. The ship had a name. Tasari Intelligence had basic translation protocols for human language. The computer ran the visible hull markings through the database. Permanent contradiction. Varric Sol read it twice. He looked at the hull geometry, the 4-dimensional shape that changed depending on how the sensor beam struck it. He looked at the material 9 centuries older than the ship it was part of. He looked at the absorbed transmissions. He looked at the weapon systems his sensors had identified along the hull. Configurations his database filed as human military. Threat assessment. Unable to complete. Unable to complete. Not because the weapons were hidden. Not because they were shielded. Because the threat assessment system required categories to work with, and the weapons along that hull did not fit into any. Permanent contradiction. He thought about that name for a while. The reply from Hegemony Command arrived in 8 minutes and 40 seconds. The duty admiral's voice was controlled and professional, and contained underneath those things the same old cold thing Varric Sol was carrying. The orders were simple. Do not approach. Do not escalate. File a full contact report. Relay coordinates to the Fringe Response Division. Maintain observation distance. Errand. This was the part the duty admiral paused before saying, which was unusual for a Tasari admiral. Warn the Orth Research Station. Varric Sol acknowledged the orders. He filed the contact report. He relayed coordinates. He hailed Orath on the secure science station channel and delivered the information in flat language. Mass. Vector. ETA. No response to hailing. Evacuate non-essential personnel as a precaution. Then he went back to watching. 6 hours into observation, something changed. The passive scan returned a new reading from the hull, a low-level field emission that Drain flagged immediately from her station. She put it on the main display. The emission matched nothing in the database. Not weapons, not a drive, not a scanner. The database noted this with the same quiet, a flat unknown that was becoming a word Varric Sol was starting to resent. But it had a direction. The field emission was directional, pointed not at Orath, not at the Deshmora, pointed inward and ahead of the ship's vector and slightly below the ecliptic, at a point in empty space that the Deshmora's charts showed as nothing at all. Dren ran a deep scan of that point. She stood very still at her console for 2 minutes before speaking. Sir, there is a gravity anomaly at the emission target point. Natural formation? No, it's structured. It has geometry. A pause. It has the same geometry as the ship's hull, the 4-dimensional geometry. Something cold moved through the bridge. The human ship was not traveling toward Orath. It had never been traveling toward Orath. The Varric Sol pulled up the vector projection and ran it against the new data. The ship's actual destination was the gravity anomaly, which was not on any Tasari chart, had never been detected before, and had the geometric signature of something the human ship had apparently built or opened or created in empty space. The Tasari had simply not noticed until now. The ship was going home. It had passed through Tasari-patrolled space the way someone walks through a room full of people on the way to their own front door, aware of the other people, not concerned about them, not hostile to them, simply going somewhere. Varric Sol sat back in his command chair. On sensors, the human ship continued its steady, unhurried transit. 4 hours later, it reached the gravity anomaly, and the passive scans went briefly and completely insane. Every reading spiking into ranges the sensors were not built to measure, then dropping to zero, not to baseline, to zero, as if all detectable phenomena in a 300-kilometer radius had held their breath. Then the ship was gone. The gravity anomaly closed behind it like water closing over a stone. For 10 seconds, no one on the bridge of the Deshmora spoke or moved. Preth broke it. Shall I file a departure notation in the contact report, sir? Yes, Varric Sol said. He sat and looked at the empty space where the ship had been, hands flat on the console, deliberately still. The contact report was perfect, every word accurate, every measurement exact, every anomalous reading listed with its sensor timestamp and its diagnostic verification. It described in technical language a sequence of events that added up to something the technical language had no way of containing. The duty admiral's acknowledgement came back 6 hours later. It thanked Varric Sol for the thorough documentation and informed him that the report had been escalated to the Fringe Response Division, then to Tasari High Command, then, in a detail unusual enough that Varric Sol read it 3 times, to the Galactic Accord Council for full review. The last line said, maintain patrol, continue observation. Note any recurrence. Varric Sol looked at the space where the human ship had been. He thought about the hull geometry, the 900-year-old material inside a 41-year-old vessel, the name painted on the side with what felt, in retrospect, like a very specific kind of humor. While he thought about the gravity anomaly, the door the ship had opened in empty space, used and closed behind it without breaking stride. He thought about the transmission he had sent on 17 frequencies, absorbed like rain into stone. He thought about unable to complete sitting in his threat assessment field where a number should have been. 27 years in the Tasari military, 63 patrol rotations, 3 previously uncatalogued species. He had never filed a contact report and felt afterward like he had reported on the wrong thing entirely. Like the real content of what he'd seen was something the report format simply did not have a field for. The permanent contradiction had crossed Tasari space. It had not asked permission. It had not needed to. Not because it was hostile, not because it was arrogant. Because the space had simply not been relevant to it. Because the Deshmora had been about as significant as furniture. Because Tasari patrol vessels and hegemony protocols and 16-stage engagement escalation frameworks were things that existed in a particular layer of reality, and the human ship had been passing through a different layer entirely, briefly and incidentally sharing the same coordinates. Like a deep current briefly sharing the same ocean as a boat on the surface. The current does not notice the boat. The permanent contradiction had gone home through its own door and closed it and left behind exactly one piece of evidence. A contact report that the Galactic Accord Council was now reading in what Varric's soul imagined was a very quiet room. He watched the empty space for a long time. Where there was an old Tessari phrase from the religious texts before the hegemony had turned everything into protocol. His grandmother had used it, a phrase for when you encountered something that made you feel, with sudden and complete certainty, how small you were. Not in a painful way, just honestly. The way looking at a clear night sky was honest. He had not thought of it in 30 years of service. He said it now, quietly in old Tasari, with no one listening. Then he straightened in his chair, opened the patrol log, and made his entry for the day. 0347 hours. Object departed via uncharted spatial anomaly at coordinates as listed. Contact window closed. No hostilities. No communication. No threat assessment completed. Object designation assigned per hull marking. Permanent contradiction. Recommend full council review. He closed the log. He thought about the name one more time. Then he went to make himself something warm to drink, because some shifts earned it, and this had been that kind of shift. The quantum lock array looked like someone had taken a fusion reactor, a mechanical watch, and a high-grade fever and asked all three to raise something together. Chief Engineer Yusra Okafor stood in front of it with a wrench in one hand and a mug of cold coffee in the other, and did not look at it the way someone looks at a machine. She looked at it the way you look at someone you've known long enough that their face no longer surprises you. She set down the coffee. She kept the wrench. She got to work. The maintenance cycle ran every 4 months. Yusra had run it 43 times on the permanent contradiction, and each time, without fail, she found something that had changed. Not broken, changed. The array was never in quite the same configuration it had been in before. Like something in it was growing, slowly, in directions that had no names in any engineering textbook she had ever read. Today's first discovery was a new coupling junction between the third probability flux manifold and the dimensional anchor housing. It had not been there 4 months ago. It was not in the construction logs. It was not in any retrofit order from Admiralty. It was built in the same style as the original components, same materials, same joining technique, and it was very clearly an improvement on the previous configuration. Yusra looked at it for a moment. She said. She made a note in her maintenance log. New junction, manifold 3 to anchor housing. Origin, unknown. Functionality, appears sound, will monitor. She moved on. The quantum lock array occupied the center section of Deck 7 in a reinforced bay that Yusra's team called the Cathedral because of how the conduits ran from floor to ceiling, like the columns of something old and deliberate. On cold starts, when the array first powered up from rest, the whole bay hummed at a frequency that you did not hear so much as feel in the back of your teeth. Yusra had long since stopped noticing it. Her apprentice, a young engineer named Bryn, had thrown up on his first day in the bay. He had claimed it was something he ate. Yusra had not corrected him because she remembered her own first week in the cathedral and the strange, creeping feeling it gave you. The sense that the air in the bay was slightly different from air in the rest of the ship. Thicker somehow, more present, like the space itself was paying attention. You got used to it. Bryn was on the far side of the array now, checking the secondary conduit alignment. Yusra could hear him muttering to himself as he worked. He was the kind of engineer who narrated his own process. And she found the sound steadying. She ran her thumb along a primary conduit. It pulsed, not with heat, not with any electrical sensation she could name. The pulse was something else, something the ship's diagnostic systems labeled as probability flux, because the original engineering team had run out of better words, and that description was at least directionally accurate, in that it described something to do with probability and something to do with movement. Yusra had stopped asking what it actually was about 6 years in. She knew what it did. Though what it did was keep the ship in the world. Or more precisely, keep the ship in one world, one layer of physical reality, one consistent set of physical laws, rather than letting it drift between layers the way it apparently could when the array was inactive. The quantum lock system was why the permanent contradiction appeared to outside sensors, as a ship with mass and vector and physical presence. Without it, what the sensors would return instead was something the original test pilots had described as a question the universe keeps asking itself. Nobody had put that in the official documentation. Yusra had read the original test pilot reports in the archives. She had read them 11 years ago, the week she accepted the transfer to the permanent contradiction. Sitting in a small office in a naval station on Callisto, with the kind of focused quiet she reserved for things that would change her. She had read the reports. She had sat with them for a long time. Then she had packed her kit and reported for duty, because some ships called to you and this one had been calling since before she could explain why. The maintenance log on her console beeped softly. She pulled it up. Bryn had flagged a hairline variance in the secondary conduit alignment on his side, within tolerance but at the high end of it. She marked it for recalibration and started across the bay. The cathedral was quieter than usual today. The ship was in transit, not the kind of transit that involved the quantum lock doing anything dramatic. It's just a standard velocity hold while they sat in their own private pocket of spatial geometry, waiting on orders from command. The probability flux was a low, steady rhythm under Yusra's hand, the held breath feeling she associated with a fully calibrated array. Except, she paused. Under the held breath, there was something else, a secondary rhythm. Faint. She might have missed it if she hadn't been looking. It was layered under the main flux, like a second heartbeat behind the first. Very soft, very deliberate. The ship was thinking about something. Yusra knew better than to say that out loud, especially in front of Bryn, who was still young enough to look for rational frameworks and would be distressed to learn that his chief engineer diagnosed the permanent contradiction the way a parent diagnoses a quiet child. But she had spent 11 years with her hands on this machine, had slept aboard it through 3 active engagements, had eaten her meals and written her letters, and drunk her cold coffee while it hummed around her. And she knew its rhythms the way you know the rhythms of a house you've lived in, long enough that its sounds become part of your own breathing. The secondary rhythm meant the ship was doing something she hadn't asked it to do. She finished the recalibration on Bryn's side, verified the secondary conduits, made her notes. Then she went back to the main array and spent an hour with the deep system diagnostics, running the kind of read that took patience and a willingness to sit with numbers that didn't always resolve into answers. She found it buried in the anchor housing. The dimensional anchor geometry, the mathematical shape that defined where the ship was locked in physical reality, had a new fold in it. Not a fault, not a crack, not a stress fracture or a drift variance. A fold. Deliberate, precise, integrated into the existing geometry, the way you might add a new room to a house that had been designed from the beginning to accommodate it. The fold added a new dimension to the anchor's hold, a new layer of stability that Yusra, running the numbers in her head, estimated would improve the ship's resistance to forced unlocking by a meaningful margin. Forced unlocking was the term for what happened when an external weapon system tried to knock the ship out of its locked physical state. In theory, if you hit the anchor hard enough with the right kind of disruptive energy, you could pull the permanent contradiction out of its lock and back into that state the test pilots had described. The question the universe kept asking itself. In that state, the ship was effectively non-existent from the perspective of physical reality, which was, depending on your situation, either very bad or very useful. An improved resistance to forced unlocking was strategically valuable. The ship had improved its own resistance to forced unlocking. While they were sitting in transit, in the quiet, in the nothing. Yusra looked at the fold for a long time. She was not technically alarmed. She had been doing this long enough that the permanent contradiction, doing something she hadn't requested, was more familiar than strange. But this was a significant self-modification. This was the array rewriting its own anchor geometry. That was not supposed to be something the array could do. She made a note. Self-modification in anchor geometry, dimensional fold, manifold housing, functional integrity confirmed, no instability detected. Recommend self-modification protocol review. Note that this is the fourth self-modification in the current maintenance cycle. She paused over that last line. Fourth. She had noted the new junction early in the morning. In her last maintenance cycle, she had noted two others, a small but elegant restructuring of the flux channels on deck 8, and a rerouting of probability bleed between the port and starboard arrays that had been, on review, more efficient than the original configuration. She had flagged all of them. She had sent the flags to Admiralty as required. Admiralty had sent back in each case, Punoni a form letter acknowledging her report and noting that a review board would assess the modifications in due course. Yusra had not heard back from any review board. She finished the deep system diagnostic and began the recalibration sequence for the morning. Bryn was done with his side and came to assist, handing her tools before she asked for them, which she appreciated. He was getting good. He had that quality the best engineers had, a kind of physical attentiveness, a way of listening to a system with your hands before you listen to it with your instruments. It feels different today, Bryn said at one point. Different how? He thought about it. Tighter, more organized. He looked at the conduit he was holding, like it's ready for something. Yusra did not respond immediately. So she finished the coupling she was working on and checked the flux reading. The secondary rhythm was still there. Soft, steady, patient. That's just how she is sometimes, Yusra said. Bryn nodded. He was smart enough to hear what she wasn't saying, which was that she agreed with him, but had no framework to put around it that wouldn't raise questions she wasn't equipped to answer. They worked through lunch. Yusra ate a protein bar standing in front of the main array without tasting it. Bryn took a proper break and came back with coffee for both of them, which was the right instinct and the kind of thing that would serve him well. By mid-afternoon, the maintenance cycle was done. Yusra ran the full verification, every reading in tolerance, every system nominal, or the array purring with the held breath feeling that meant it was fully and properly calibrated. She logged the completion, then she stood in front of it one more time and put her bare hand flat against the primary conduit housing. The pulse came back steady, the held breath, under it, very faint, the secondary rhythm, waiting. She thought about Bryn's word, ready. She thought about the self-modified anchor fold, which was not supposed to be possible. She thought about the new coupling junction. She thought about the 4 modifications this cycle and the ones before it. The accumulated small changes she had been noting and flagging and watching for 11 years. The way the ship's own architecture kept quietly, calmly improving itself without being asked. She thought about what she knew about the permanent contradictions history. Not the official history, which was available in Navy archives and described a technically advanced vessel with a distinguished service record. The other history, the one you only found in the old incident logs if you knew what you were looking for. 14 years ago, the permanent contradiction had been assigned to a battle group at the Meridian system. Standard patrol assignment. The Meridian ambush had been an ambush in the truest sense. No warning, no intelligence failure they could explain, just an enemy force that appeared where no force should have been and hit hard enough to destroy 46 ships before any of them could react. 46 ships. One survivor. The permanent contradiction had been the survivor. It had not survived because of its crew's quick thinking or superior tactics or fortunate position. It had survived because in the first 3 seconds of the ambush, with no conscious command from the bridge, the quantum lock array had reconfigured itself into a state that had never been in any engineering manual, and the ship had effectively ceased to exist in physical reality long enough for the initial strike to pass through it. Then it had come back. It had fought its way out of the Meridian system alone, its crew reduced to 12 people in the first minutes, the bridge destroyed, navigation non-functional, with no captain and no orders and no clear path home. It had traveled 17 light years through hostile space, alone, and it had made decisions, routing decisions, evasion decisions, engagement decisions, that nobody had input. It had brought 12 people home, 12 of its 47. Yusra had read that report sitting in the office on Callisto, with her hands flat on the desk because she had needed something to hold on to. 6 months later, she had reported for duty aboard the Permanent Contradiction, and on her first day, she had walked into the cathedral and put her hand on the primary conduit, and the pulse had come back immediately. Not surprised, not uncertain. Like something recognizing something. She had told exactly no one this. She had no language for it that wasn't embarrassing. She finished her shift notes. She filed the modification flags. She told Bryn he'd done good work and sent him to his bunk. Then she spent a few minutes alone in the cathedral in the dark, which was a thing she did at the end of every maintenance cycle and which she would have denied doing if asked. Yet the probability flux moved under the hull around her, slow and deep and even. 4 modifications this cycle, Yusra said. Not accusatory, just noting it in the way of someone who catalogs instead of confronts. The flux did not change. I saw the fold. That's good work. A pause. Don't know what you're getting ready for, but if it's something big, you'd better tell me first. The secondary rhythm pulsed once. Faint, unmistakable. Whether that meant something or not, Yusra could not say with any scientific certainty. She picked up her toolbox and her cold coffee and walked back through the cathedral toward the door. Good girl, she said to the hull without looking back, the way you say it when you mean it. Behind her, deep in the dimensional anchor housing, in the new fold that should not have existed, and the probability flux settled into the hell-breath feeling of a system perfectly calibrated and quietly waiting. Outside the ship's hull, the stars hung still, and the dark was complete, and the permanent contradiction sat in it with all the patience of something that understood time differently than the people inside it did. It had a fold in its anchor geometry that would make it harder to knock out of physical reality. It had made it while they were sitting in the quiet, doing nothing. It had made it because something, somewhere in the calculation of its own continuing existence, had decided the fold would be needed. Not soon necessarily, but needed. The ship held its breath and waited. Admiral Keth Vara looked at the sensor readout for exactly 2 seconds before deciding it was irrelevant. One human ship, whatever its anomalies, whatever the Tassari patrol report said, whatever the intelligence files flagged, numbers were numbers, physics was physics. And the physics of one vessel against 140 was the kind of math that settled itself before anyone fired the first shot. Kethvare had not risen to command a Dominion strike fleet by treating uncertainty as a reason for caution. He had risen because he understood that the galaxy's greatest mistake, species after species, was to let novelty frighten them into hesitation. Something new and strange in your path was still a physical object. Physical objects followed physical rules. Physical rules did not make exceptions. This was what he believed. He had believed it for 38 years of distinguished military service. He had approximately 43 minutes left to believe it. Weigh the Dominion's clarity, his flagship, the lead ship of a 140-vessel strike force, the largest active deployment outside the Dominion's home territory, came out of transit into the edge of the fringe with full tactical systems live and the rest of the fleet spreading into formation behind it like a hand opening. Standard assault spread, clean, practiced, each ship finding its place in the formation with the precision that came from years of joint exercises and 3 active campaigns. The human ship was where the intelligence said it would be. Kethvara looked at it on the main display and felt nothing in particular, which was the state he had trained himself to reach before engagements. No anxiety, no excitement, just the clean, cold workspace of a mind focused on process. Confirmed target, he said. Confirmed, Admiral. It's single vessel. Hull mass consistent with a midweight dreadnought class. Designated in Accord intelligence files as, the tactical officer paused briefly, Permanent Contradiction. Kethvara noted the name without comment. Formation status? All 140 vessels in position, Admiral. Full assault spread complete. Weapon status? All systems charged and ready. Full spectrum suppression package on your command. Kethvara looked at the human ship on the display. It sat still in the dark. No active weapon signatures, no elevated power output. From a tactical read, it looked like a vessel that was either running cold or not paying attention. Either way, the result was the same. The Dominion's rejection of the Silence Accords had been 5 years in the making. A formal withdrawal from the Galactic Accord Council, and filed with all proper documentation, followed by 2 years of quiet positioning and fleet building and intelligence gathering. The Accords in the Dominion's position had been a mistake, not a bad negotiation, a fundamental error in judgment. 50 years of treating the human species as a managed problem had given them 50 years to become something that could not be managed. The correct moment to have addressed this had been before the permanent contradiction existed. The second correct moment was now. 140 ships, one human vessel. The math was simple. Open the engagement, Kethvara said. The full-spectrum suppression volley left the Dominion fleet in a wave. 1,400 individual weapons discharges, kinetic mass drivers, plasma cannon batteries, guided missile systems, quantum disruptors that could unravel the structural integrity of a ship down to its molecular bonds. The Dominion's standard full engagement package was what they used on hardened military stations. Overkill for a single vessel, technically, but Kethvara was not interested in proving points with acceptable losses. He was interested in ending this before the human ship could orient and respond. The weapons crossed 8,000 kilometers. Kethvara watched the tactical display. 1 second, 2, 5. The weapons reached the human ship. Kethvara opened his mouth to say something. Some acknowledgement of completion, something brief and practical, the kind of professional closure he used at the end of engagements, the habit of 38 years. He did not get to finish the thought. The tactical display went wrong. Not wrong like a malfunction, not screaming alerts or failed systems or corrupted data. Wrong like a student's exam answer that was written with confidence in impeccable handwriting and was complete nonsense. The data was returned clearly, precisely, and it described a sequence of events that physics did not contain. The kinetic rounds arrived at the hull. They arrived as light, not as impact, not as kinetic energy transferring into hull material and causing damage through physical force. The mass drivers had fired solid metal slugs, dense and fast and hard. The slugs reached the hull of the permanent contradiction, and the tactical system logged them arriving as photons. Photons, massless, traveling at light speed, no momentum, no impact force. They struck the hull the way sunlight strikes a wall. Kethvara stared at the readout. Report, he said. Kinetic impacts are showing as, Admiral, the system is logging them as photon contact. No structural stress on target. No. Tactical Officer Reth paused, and in that pause, Kethvara could hear something he had never heard in Reth's voice in 7 years of service. No explanation available, Admiral. The plasma batteries. Reth checked. Kethvara watched him check and saw from the set of Reth's shoulders that the answer was going to be wrong before he heard it. Plasma bolts arrived as acoustic waves, Admiral. That's not possible. No, Admiral. They arrived as acoustic waves. There is no medium for them to travel through. A pause. They stopped, Admiral. They are logged as stopped. Present tense, they are sitting in space approximately 4 meters from the target hull. Stopped sound waves. In vacuum. Point where sound could not exist and therefore could not stop. Kethvara looked at the display and felt the clean, cold workspace in his mind begin to develop cracks. The missile systems. Reth's hands moved on his console. He looked at the results. He said nothing for a moment. Then, Admiral, the guided missiles detonated, but the system is logging the detonations as having occurred in, it says probability space, sir. The explosions are logged as having generated statistical anomalies in nearby systems rather than physical force. What does that mean? It means, Admiral, our targeting computers on vessels in the 3rd and 4th formation rows are experiencing anomalous behavior. Randomly incorrect targeting solutions appearing in their systems. Minor errors, as if the blast translated into wrong information in nearby computers instead of damage to the target. 3 rows of ships were getting false data in their targeting systems because the missiles that had been meant to destroy the permanent contradiction had detonated in probability space and come out as corrupted calculations. Kethvara stood very still at the command console. The full-spectrum suppression package had been fired. 1,400 weapons had been deployed against a single target. The single target was showing no damage, no structural stress, no power loss, no system degradation of any kind. His tactical AI had crashed trying to process and categorize what had happened to the weapons. It had filed 37 separate incident reports, all generated in the last 6 seconds, and they all contradicted each other. 37 incident reports in 6 seconds, all contradictory. The AI, and Kethvara understood, had encountered something it could not fit into any of its categories and had responded by generating a report for every category simultaneously, as if quantity of categorization could compensate for the failure of any single one. He thought with some distant part of his mind that was still capable of thought like this, that he understood how the AI felt. On the tactical display, the human ship moved. It turned. The turn was slow, not the evasive, reactive turn of a vessel under fire trying to redirect its defenses, not the combat turn of a vessel preparing to strike from a new angle. Slow, deliberate, the way something turns when it has made a decision and is taking its time implementing it, because hurry is for things that are uncertain. The permanent contradiction turned until its main weapons array faced the Dominion fleet. Kethvara had a moment, one moment, a fraction of a second, where he considered giving the order to scatter, to break formation and run, every ship for itself, with speed and distance as the only strategy. He did not give the order, not because he was brave, because in that fraction of a second, he looked at the tactical display and understood, at some level below rational thought, that it would not have mattered. The permanent contradiction had made its decision before it turned. It had made its decision. The Kethvara who would survive this would eventually understand. Before the Dominion fleet had come out of transit, before the first shot was fired, the human ship fired, Kethvara had reviewed every intelligence file on human weapon systems. However, he knew the technical specifications of every documented human naval weapon. He had expected energy weapons, kinetic systems, the advanced but ultimately comprehensible physics-based armament that human engineers had been building for the last century. What the permanent contradiction deployed did not appear in any intelligence file, because what it deployed was not technically a weapon. It was a reclassification. Kethvara watched the tactical display as, one by one, in groups of 3 and 4, Dominion vessels began to. The display struggled for a word, the system flagging and reflagging, and finally settling on a word it borrowed from its own database, discontinued, not destroyed, not disabled, not damaged. The hull integrity readings did not drop. The power signatures did not cut off. The vessel simply ceased to register as present, not as destroyed, as present. The system had a category for destroyed. It had a category for disabled, for damaged, for retreating, for out of range. It had never needed a category for this. Discontinued, like a line of text that had been removed from the page, not erased, not crossed out, but simply no longer existing in a way that could be detected by anyone still reading. 8 vessels, 12, 20, the tactical display updating in real time, the formation that had been 140 vessels becoming 130, then 110, then 90, and the permanent contradiction was still turning, slowly, working its way through the formation with the patience of something doing maintenance. No drama to it, no ferocity. It was not attacking, it was correcting. Areth had stopped reporting. There was nothing useful to report. He stood at his station and watched the display with the expression of someone whose entire professional framework had just been quietly taken apart. Kethvara gripped the edge of the command console. He was going to give an order. He was composing it. He was going to give the retreat order, the scatter order, anything. The composure of 38 years insisting there was still a correct protocol to follow, still a next step that existed within the rules he knew. He stopped, because the permanent contradiction had stopped. It sat still in the display again. The same unhurried, cold stillness it had held since they arrived. Around it, where 92 Dominion vessels had been, there was nothing. The remaining 48 ships sat frozen in their positions, not retreating, not advancing, not doing anything at all. Kethvara realized with some delay that the frozen ships were frozen because their crews had not been given orders and were waiting on the same thing he was. Some indication of what came next. What came next was nothing. The permanent contradiction did not advance on the remaining vessels. It did not hail them. It did not broadcast warnings or terms of surrender or any communication of any kind. It sat in the space where 92 ships had been and was simply there. Kethvara did not understand why it had stopped. He did not understand why he was still alive, why the Dominion's clarity was still present, why 47 other Dominion vessels were still present. He thought about those numbers. 92 gone, 48 remaining. One of the distribution was not random. He looked at the display, at which vessels had been taken and which had been left, and there was a pattern to it. The vessels left were spread across the formation, 1 here, 3 there, positioned in a way that would make no military sense if you were trying to leave survivors capable of fighting back. It made sense if you were leaving survivors capable of going home. He had been left alive to report back. The permanent contradiction had decided this. Not in the moment, not as a mercy decision made in the chaos of engagement. It had decided before the engagement began which ships would go home and which would not, and it had executed that decision with the same calm patience it applied to everything else. It had always been going to stop when it stopped. He had always been going to survive. The floor dropped out of a very large portion of what Kethvara understood about warfare. Reth found his voice. "Admiral, orders?" Kethvara stood up straight. He breathed in and out once, deliberately. "All remaining vessels. Cease all active systems. Weapons cold. Full stop." A pause. "And hail the human ship." "Frequency, Admiral?" "All of them." The hail went out on every available frequency. Kethvara waited, not expecting a response, and was not surprised when none came. The permanent contradiction absorbed the hail the way it had absorbed the Tasari patrol commander's hail, the way it absorbed everything, without acknowledgement, without comment. It did not need to respond. It had already said everything it intended to say. Kethvara thought about the 92 ships, about the word the tactical display had used, discontinued. And he thought about the 37 contradictory incident reports his AI had filed in 6 seconds. He thought about kinetic slugs that became light and plasma bolts that became stop sound, and missiles that became wrong answers in someone else's computer. He thought about the intelligence files, the technical briefings, the strategy sessions where the Dominion's finest military minds had reviewed every piece of available data on human naval capacity and concluded with calm and systematic confidence that a 140-vessel fleet was more than sufficient. He thought about the name on the hull of the ship sitting in the middle of the space where his fleet used to be. Permanent contradiction. He had thought that was a boast. He understood now that it was a description. The permanent contradiction was not a warship that broke the rules of warfare. It was not a vessel that ignored the rules of physics. It was a thing that existed in genuine contradiction to the framework of reality that every other spacefaring species had agreed to operate within, that existed alongside that framework rather than within it, touching it only when it chose to, engaging with it on its own terms. You could not fight something like that. You could not outthink it. You could not surprise it. You could not build a weapon against it, because building a weapon required an understanding of what you were targeting, and what you were targeting was something that looked at your weapon, evaluated its nature, and quietly changed what it was made of before it arrived. "Admiral," Reth's voice careful, "the human ship is moving." It was leaving, not in the direction it had come from, not retreating. It was moving deeper into open space, its vector unhurried, its systems showing nothing. No victory broadcast, no communication. It simply went, the way it had gone from the Tasari patrol commander's range, without acknowledgement, without ceremony, like a thing that had done what it came to do. Kethvara watched it on the display until the signal faded to the edge of sensor range. He kept watching after that, at the empty display, at the space where 140 ships had been, and 48 now were. "Reth," he said, "Admiral, send a full report to command. All data. All of it, including the AI incident reports. Especially the incident reports." He paused. "Tell them we need a complete strategic review." "Yes, Admiral. And note in the report, note specifically, that the human vessel made no attempt to destroy all vessels in the fleet, that the vessel ceased engagement with 48 ships remaining, that the distribution of remaining vessels appears non-random, that it appears in the tactical assessment officer's professional judgment." He stopped, started again. "That it appears we were left alive on purpose." Reth typed it exactly as he said it. Kethvara sat back down in his command chair. The display showed him 48 ships in a formation that had been designed for 140. It showed him empty space where the permanent contradiction had been. It showed him, in the corner of the screen, the AI's pending 37 incident reports, all still contradictory, when all still waiting for a resolution it had not been able to provide. He looked at the reports for a long time. Then he closed them without resolving them. Some things he was beginning to understand did not resolve. They just sat open. They just stayed contradictory. And the correct response to that was not to keep filing incident reports until the contradiction went away, but to sit with the contradiction and figure out what it was telling you. It was telling him something about the species that had built that ship. It was telling him something about what it meant to live in a galaxy where that species existed. He was going to need a long time to think about it. He had survived. He suspected that had been the point. Dr. Amara Singh set her notes on the podium. She looked at them for a moment. As she left them there and stepped to the side of the podium, where there was nothing between her and the assembled representatives of 14 spacefaring civilizations, and she looked at the room. The Galactic Accord Council chamber was built for occasions exactly like this one. A circular hall, tiered seating, acoustic design that carried every word to every seat with equal clarity. It had hosted the original Silence Accord negotiations. It had hosted the census of the Quarantine Fringe. It had hosted every major interspecies diplomatic crisis for the last 2 centuries, and it was designed to make all of those things feel manageable. The proportions were calming. The lighting was neutral. Everything about the architecture said, problems have solutions, and this is a room where they get solved. The representatives of 14 civilizations sat in it and looked at Amara Singh, and not one of them looked calm. "You want to know how we built it," Singh said. "The honest answer is that we didn't, fully. We built what we intended. The ship finished the rest. Those are different things. I'll explain why." She had the room's full attention, the way a very small weather event has the full attention of the landscape around it, completely and with a quality of waiting. Singh had been the United Human Astrophysics Collective's chief theoretical physicist for 12 years and its director for 4. She was 63 years old, small in every physical sense, and possessed of the kind of stillness that was not peace but precision. Every movement chosen, every word positioned. So she had given this briefing in private to a Human Security Council 3 months ago, and had spent those 3 months adjusting it for a multi-species audience, which primarily meant slowing it down and removing the parts where she assumed everyone in the room had the same base education. She had not made it gentler. "Let me start with history," she said. "Not the history you have in your intelligence files, the actual history." She pulled up the first display. It showed a timeline, human spaceflight development, marked at intervals with the significant technological milestones. Any intelligence file on human civilization had this timeline. Every representative in the room had seen some version of it. "Every species in this room," Singh said, "developed space travel in roughly the same way. You identified the relevant physics first. You built theoretical models. You verified the models in controlled environments. You engineered working systems based on the verified models. Physics first, then engineering. You treated the laws of physics as the foundation on which everything else was built." She paused. "Humans did it in the other order." A murmur moved through the room. Not loud, the kind of murmur that represented 14 civilizations each, doing its own quiet version of looking at each other. "Our first significant propulsion breakthrough came from a researcher at what was then the University of Lagos. working in a lab with inadequate funding and outdated equipment. He was trying to demonstrate a theoretical model for confined plasma behavior. His equipment malfunctioned in a specific way. When the malfunction generated a propulsion effect he had not predicted and could not at the time explain. He ran the experiment again. The effect repeated. He built a larger version. It worked better. He published his results, and 3 peer review boards rejected the paper because the underlying physics, as presented, did not hold together. She let that sit. He built a prototype anyway, in a converted equipment shed. The prototype worked. The propulsion effect was real, consistent, and significantly more efficient than any existing system. The physics still didn't hold together. Nobody could explain, in any existing framework, why it worked. We shipped it. Another murmur, slightly louder. That pattern, Singh said, repeated. Not once, not twice. That is the consistent shape of human technological development. We build things that work before we understand why they work. We use the results to build the theory. Sometimes the theory catches up, sometimes it doesn't. In the case of the quantum lock system, the theoretical framework is approximately 600 years behind the engineering. She looked at the Tesserae High Council representative, who had been sitting very still since the briefing began. Your sensor team noted that the permanent contradictions hull material dated as 900 years old in a 41-year-old vessel. I want to explain what that means. The material the hull is composed of, the composite that your sensors returned as unknown, is a result of the quantum lock system operating on the hull itself during manufacture. The lock array, running during the construction process, subjected the hull material to probability flux exposure at a specific resonance. What that does, in plain language, is that it takes the material outside of standard time as experienced by physical objects. The material ages in accordance with its own internal physics, not with the external timeline. She let that land. The hull is 900 years old because in the frame of reference of the hull material, 900 years have passed. In external time, 41 years have passed. Both are accurate. They exist simultaneously. The hull is old because age for that material is a structural property, not a record of time elapsed. It is more stable, more resistant to physical stress, more resistant to energy transfer than any material you can manufacture in standard time because it has had 900 years to reach its natural equilibrium state. The Dominion Council representative, who was present as an observer, stripped of all but 2 of his colleagues after the Meridian incident in what the diplomatic notes called a cautionary capacity, raised a hand. Singh nodded at him. Dr. Singh. His voice was carefully neutral in the way of someone who had decided strategically that neutral was the safest register for this room. The weapons the permanent contradiction deployed at the Meridian engagement. Can you describe their mechanism? No, Singh said. A silence. I can describe what they do. I can describe the engineering of the systems that deliver them. I cannot describe the physics. Said it will because our theoretical framework does not have a model for what they do that we have verified. We know what they do because we have tested them. We know how to build them because we built them. We do not know in any framework that would satisfy the standard definition of scientific understanding why they work. She looked at the room. The weapon system on the permanent contradiction interacts with the probability state of matter. Every physical object exists in a probability state. It is where it is, with the properties it has, rather than anywhere else with any other properties, because its probability state is locked at a specific resolution. The permanent contradictions weapons interact with that lock. They can change the resolution. They can change what something is. That is why your kinetic weapons became photons. And the projectile's probability state was changed in transit. Its resolution shifted. Its most probable identity in the new state was light, so it became light. She paused. The vessel-level application does something similar to the target vessel's entire probability state. The vessel ceases to be probable in the location and configuration it occupied. Your tactical system used the word discontinued. That is reasonably accurate. The Tesserae representative leaned forward. Where do they go? We don't know, Singh said. Our best current model suggests they are still present, but resolved into a probability state that does not intersect with detectable reality in any location we can measure. They are somewhere. We cannot tell you where. The room was very quiet. I want to be clear, Singh said, because clarity is useful here, and the alternative is fear operating on incomplete information. The permanent contradiction is not unique in its core technology. It is the most advanced current expression of that technology. But the quantum lock system and its derivatives are present in varying degrees across the human naval fleet. The probability weapon system is present in a smaller subset. We have been developing these systems for 40 years. The permanent contradiction is the farthest along. She paused. How far along it actually is, even we are not entirely certain. The ship has been self-modifying its core systems for the last 14 years. Our chief engineer files maintenance reports that describe modifications our engineering teams cannot reproduce in controlled environments. The ship is ahead of us. The room absorbed that. Yes, Singh had watched rooms absorb things for 40 years of scientific presentations, and she had developed a sensitivity to the different textures of silence. There was the silence of confusion, the silence of denial, the silence of someone who has just been handed a problem they do not know how to categorize. The silence of recognition, the moment before a thinker reaches a conclusion they can feel before they can articulate. What she heard in this room was something she had not encountered before in a professional setting. It was the silence of people encountering a fundamental shift in their understanding of who they shared the galaxy with, and doing so together in real time with no private space to process it. She gave them a moment. I want to address the strategic framing directly, she said. After all, because I imagine that is what a significant portion of this room is currently calculating. She had their complete attention. The question you are forming is, what does this mean for the balance of power in the Accord? What does it mean that one species has this technology and the others do not? What are the terms under which this technology might be deployed, restricted, shared, or used as leverage? I understand why those are the natural questions. I want to offer a different frame. She stepped back to the podium and picked up her notes, not to read from them, just to hold them, a small human gesture. The permanent contradiction fought at Meridian because the Dominion crossed into human space with a fleet of 140 warships. The engagement took 11 seconds. 92 vessels were discontinued. 48 were left functional and intact, in a non-random distribution specifically selected to preserve maximum capacity for return transit. A pause. The ship had decided who would survive before the first weapon was fired. Silence. We did not order that engagement. The permanent contradiction was in transit in that sector on unrelated orders. It encountered the Dominion fleet. It acted. Another pause. In reviewing the post-engagement tactical data, our naval analysts concluded that the ship's chosen outcome, 92 discontinued, 48 returned to deliver a report, was the outcome that, in the ship's own calculation, would produce the most stable result. Not the most favorable result for humanity, the most stable result for everyone. She let that sit as long as it needed to. Or the permanent contradiction is not a weapon we point at problems. It is not a deterrent we display in negotiations. It is a vessel with its own decision-making capacity, its own understanding of situations, its own sense of what outcomes serve the broader stability of the systems it operates in. We guide it, we crew it, we maintain it. She set down the notes. Whether we control it is a more complicated question that I will not answer dishonestly by claiming simple yes. The Accord Council Chair, a Velith, ancient by any species standard, present for the original Silence Accord signing and reportedly unchanged since, spoke for the first time. The Velith voice was low and layered, multiple harmonics, and the chamber's acoustics carried all of them. Dr. Singh, in your assessment, does the vessel understand the political significance of its own existence? Singh considered the question for a full 3 seconds, which in her presentation style was the equivalent of a long pause. Yes, she said, I believe it does. And does it have a preference for how that significance is expressed? Singh thought about Yusra Okafor's maintenance reports, about the 43 calibration cycles worth of self-modifications, each one improving the ship's capacity for exactly the kind of engagement it had demonstrated at Meridian. About the 14 years of a ship quietly, steadily making itself better at the thing it had decided it existed to do. Stability, she said. In my best assessment, it prefers stability. The council chair was quiet for a moment. That is either very reassuring or very frightening, Dr. Singh. Yes, she agreed. Both things operate simultaneously. That is, as you may have noticed, something of a recurring theme with this ship. No one laughed. But across 14 representatives, something shifted. A slight adjustment, a small collective release of held breath. Not relaxation, recalibration. Singh gathered her notes. I'll take questions. I'll answer what I can honestly answer. For the rest, I'll tell you we don't know, because we don't, and inventing answers to questions like these is more dangerous than living in the uncertainty. She looked at the room. We have lived in the uncertainty for 40 years. It is not comfortable. It produces ships like the permanent contradiction. She paused one last time. I will tell you, as a parting frame, every species in this room developed technology by first understanding the universe and then engineering with it. We developed technology by engineering with the universe before we understood it. You learned what was possible and built to the edge of it. We built past the edge and learned afterward how far we had gone. She looked at the empty display behind her, the timeline of human spaceflight still showing. We don't know where the edge is. We have never known. We have never stopped. She picked up her notes and walked away from the podium, and the council chamber held the particular silence of a room full of very intelligent minds, sitting with something that was going to take them a long time to finish thinking about. The assessment team's first report came back in 4 hours instead of 4 weeks, and that was the first sign. The lead structural engineer, not Yusra, someone official, someone sent by Admiralty with proper credentials and a mandate to produce a thorough analysis of the permanent contradiction for the post-Meridian strategic review, submitted a single paragraph. The paragraph said in very careful professional language that the vessel could not be fully assessed because its internal geometry did not match any recorded construction specification, that there were compartments with no corresponding entry in any build log, and that those compartments returned different spatial measurements on consecutive scans. Not slightly different, significantly different, as if the rooms themselves were deciding how large to be depending on who was measuring them. The paragraph ended with a request that the report be classified at the highest level available. The classification request was approved. The report leaked anyway, as things with that classification level invariably did, and within 48 hours the full text was circulating among the permanent contradictions crew in the way that things circulated aboard ship, passed person to person, read quickly, discussed in low voices in the engineering bays, and the mess in the small maintenance corridors that ran along the outer hull. The crew was on mandatory leave. Orders from Naval Command, standing post-engagement protocol. 7 days shore leave for all crew after an active engagement, no exceptions. Most of them were in port. Most of them had chosen to spend their first day of leave sitting on the outer docking arm of Waystation Harris, looking at the permanent contradiction sitting in its berth below. Nobody had organized this. Nobody had suggested it. They had simply independently ended up in the same place, on a long metal arm extending over the ship's hull, eating sandwiches and drinking coffee and not talking very much, the way people sit with a thing they don't have words for. Captain Ren Faddle sat at the far end of the arm with both legs hanging over the edge, his back very straight in the way that had nothing to do with military posture and everything to do with the particular kind of stillness he carried. He was looking at the ship's prow section. He had been looking at it for a long time. Fidel was the kind of commander who was invisible in most situations. Not because he was weak or absent, but because he had the quality of being the still point that everything else oriented around. Visible only when you looked directly at him, there in your peripheral awareness always. He had commanded the permanent contradiction for 2 years, and in that time had developed the habit that Yusra had noticed in him quietly. He touched the hull when he thought no one was watching. Bare hand, flat against the plating. Never for long, just contact. Just a moment. She had never mentioned it. She sat a few meters down the arm from him now, feet dangling, cold coffee in both hands, looking at the same section of hull. Around her, the rest of the senior crew were scattered along the arm's length. Navigation Chief Doro with her tablet, officially reviewing charts and actually staring into space. Engineer Bryn, who had come even though he was not technically senior crew, because he had been there for the maintenance cycle, and somehow that counted. Medical Officer Petra with her eyes closed and her face tipped toward the distant weak light of Harris's star. The ship below them sat in its berth with the quiet it always carried in port. From this angle, you could see the hull sections that the assessment team had been unable to categorize. Where the material took on that quality, Yusra had been noting for 11 years. The subtle wrongness of something that existed in more dimensions than it was showing you at any given moment. The hull looked dark and still. The probability flux was low, barely detectable, even to her. Bryn had read the leaked assessment report and was being very careful to seem like he was not thinking about it. "She grew new room," he said eventually, to no one in particular. Nobody answered for a moment. "She's done it before," Yusra said. "Third deck has had 2 compartments since about 6 years ago that aren't in the build log. Nobody uses them for anything. They're just there." "What's in them?" Yusra thought about it. "The first time I went in, it looked empty. The second time there was a workbench. The third time the workbench was gone. I stopped going in after that." Bryn processed this. Stopped going in because it was unsettling? Stopped going in because whatever she was working on in there was clearly none of my business. Down the arm, Doro put down her tablet. Petra opened her eyes. Fidel, at the far end, did not move. A message had come from Admiralty that morning. So they had all been copied. Standard procedure for senior crew communications. Classification, Omega. Subject line, Next Generation Vessel Architecture, Development Authorization. The body of the message requested Senior Engineer Okafor's technical input on quantum lock system scaling, Captain Fidel's operational assessment of command structure requirements for autonomous action-capable vessels, and Dr. Singh's theoretical support for a new series of 5 ships to be built on the permanent contradictions design principles. 5 ships. On the permanent contradictions design principles, which nobody fully understood, to be built by an engineering process that had, the first time, produced something that had then spent 14 years quietly improving on its own design in ways the engineers could not reproduce. 5 more. "What I keep thinking about the 5, Doro said. The thing nobody had been saying out loud, finally said. "It's not replication," Yusra said. "We can't replicate her. That's not what they're doing." "What are they doing?" Yusra looked at the hull. "Introducing 5 more variables. Seeing what develops." She drank her cold coffee. She was never the plan exactly. She was the result of a process. They want 5 more results. And they'll be different from her. Completely. Maybe better in some ways, worse in others, different. Whatever they become, they'll become it themselves, same way she did. She paused. That's what the build team doesn't understand yet. You don't build something like her. You start something like her. Then you get out of the way. From the far end of the arm, Fidel spoke. And he had a low voice that traveled well in quiet spaces. "She knows about the message." Nobody asked how he knew. After 2 years aboard the permanent contradiction, nobody asked Fidel questions like that. "How does she feel about it?" Petra asked. Fidel took a moment. "Curious," he said. "She's curious about what they'll be like." The word sat in the air. Below them, the ship's hull caught the station light in that particular way it had, not reflecting it cleanly but pulling it in slightly, as if the material preferred to absorb rather than give back. A 900-year-old hull on a 41-year-old ship, and both of those numbers were true simultaneously. Yusra thought about what Dr. Singh had said at the council briefing. She had read the transcript. She thought about the phrase that had stayed with her. "The ship is ahead of us." Aunt Singh had said it plainly, in a room full of alien representatives, and the room had gone quiet in a way that meant the phrase had landed exactly as heavy as it should. The ship was ahead of them. It always had been. From the first week Yusra had reported aboard and put her hand on the primary conduit and felt something that recognized her. From the first maintenance cycle where she found the first change, small, precise, self-evidently correct, that she hadn't made. From the moment she'd understood that the permanent contradiction was not a machine her team maintained, but an ongoing relationship they participated in. She had been thinking about the self-modified anchor fold for days, the one she'd found in the last maintenance cycle, the one that improved resistance to forced unlocking. She had written it up, flagged it, filed it with Admiralty. She had not written in the report what she actually thought, which was the ship knew Meridian was coming, not the specific engagement. I can't prove that, but the capacity it needed for Meridian. It built that capacity 6 weeks before the Dominion fleet arrived. Quietly, while we were in transit doing nothing. She had not written that because there was no scientific framework for it, because it described the permanent contradiction as having a kind of awareness of its own future that nothing in known physics permitted, because writing it down officially would generate a review process that would involve people who did not know the ship trying to understand it through instruments, and she had enough experience with that to know what they would return. Unknown. They would file the report and mark it unknown and move on, and the ship would make another modification, and the next review team would file another unknown. And somewhere in the gap between the reports and the reality, the permanent contradiction would keep quietly becoming more of what it was. Bryn finished his sandwich. He looked at the hull for a moment. Then he asked the question he had clearly been building towards since he sat down. Do you think she's... is she... He stopped. Is she aware? Like, actually aware? Like a... Don't finish that question, Yusra said. Not because the answer is no, because the answer isn't something that fits in the sentence you're building. Bryn stopped. Thought about that. Nodded slowly. The crew sat on the docking arm in the quiet of a station that was itself quietly going about its business around them. Somewhere below, in the permanent contradictions cathedral, the quantum lock array maintained its slow, deep pulse. The probability flux was steady, the held breath. Fidel stood up from the end of the arm, unhurried, and walked back toward the crew. He stopped next to Yusra. I'm going to walk the hull, he said, before the assessment team comes back. He said it as a statement, not a request, as if he was telling her rather than inviting her. Yusra nodded. He went below. A few minutes later, she could see him on the hull through the docking arms grating. Magnetic boots, one hand trailing against the plating the way it always did, moving along the prow section slowly. The ship under him sat entirely still. He asked no active systems, no detectable response. But the probability flux on the hand console she hadn't put away shifted. One beat, warm, slow, then settled back. She watched Fidel move along the hull, and she thought about 5 new ships, 5 new processes that would run their course and produce 5 new results that nobody could fully predict. 5 new relationships between human crew and something that was not quite human and not quite machine, and not fully described by any category that existed in the taxonomy of what the galaxy knew how to name. 5 new unknowns. She thought about the permanent contradictions first year, the year before she'd come aboard. She had read everything there was to read about it. The initial sea trials, where 3 separate engineering teams had filed reports describing a vessel that consistently performed beyond any stated specification and sometimes beyond the physical parameters that should have constrained it. The first captain, who had written one private report, not official, never filed, found years later in his personal archive, that said, I think she understands what she is. I think she understood before we did. He had been killed at Meridian. The 12 survivors the ship had brought home had all requested reassignment to other vessels. All of them. The standard explanation was trauma, and that was probably true. But Yusra had read their transfer requests, and something in the language of them said something else. Not trauma, exactly. More like having been in the presence of something very large and very quiet, and feeling afterward that you could not quite fit back into the scale of normal things. She understood that. She just responded to it differently. The Omega message sat in her console queue. She opened it and looked at the bottom of it, where Admiralty had added a handwritten note from the Admiral of Naval Research. An unusual touch, the kind of personal notation that meant the message was more than procedural. Oka 4. We want to build something better than the contradiction. We want your input on how. She stared at that line for a while. Then she replied in the short, direct style she used for Admiralty communications. You don't build something better than the contradiction. Wesh, you build the best version you can, and then you leave it alone and see what it becomes. I'll consult on the former. Nobody can consult on the latter. That part's not ours. She sent it. She put the console away. Below, Fidel had reached the prow section. He stood with his hand flat against the hull and his face turned slightly away. And from where she was sitting on the arm above him, he looked very small against the ship's hull, and the ship's hull looked very large against the dark of the station bay. And the dark of the station bay was a small and local thing against the dark of everything outside. The probability flux pulsed, slow and deep. The held breath held. Yusra sat on the docking arm and finished her cold coffee and thought about 5 ships, about 5 processes starting, about 5 vessels that would spend their first years being built and their next years becoming what they were going to become, and the engineers who would maintain them, finding new junctions and new folds and making their notes and filing their flags and learning. Slowly, what it meant to be in relationship with something that was ahead of you. She hoped the engineers were the right kind of people. The right kind, in her experience, were not the ones who weren't unsettled. Everybody was unsettled. The right kind were the ones who were unsettled and showed up anyway, who put their hand on the hull on the first day and felt whatever was in there come back at them and decided quietly that this was worth it, that whatever this was, this thing that didn't fit in any category, this machine that wasn't exactly a machine, in this ship that kept building itself towards something it had not yet told anyone, was worth showing up for. She had showed up for 11 years. She intended to show up for 11 more. Somewhere in the permanent contradictions anchor housing, in the fold that should not have existed, the probability flux breathed even and slow, holding the ship in one layer of reality among the many it could reach if it chose to. Outside the hull, the station lights caught the 900-year-old material and were gently, completely absorbed. The permanent contradiction sat in its berth. It was not waiting. Waiting was for things that didn't know what was coming. It was ready, in the way a tide is ready, in the way a season is ready, in the way any large and patient thing is ready when it has made every preparation it needs to make, and the only remaining variable is time. And time was something it understood differently from the people inside it. 5 ships were going to be built. 5 more processes were going to start. Whatever they became, they would become it in their own time, in their own way, ahead of the people who built them in every direction that mattered. The galaxy was going to need a while to adjust. The permanent contradiction was willing to be patient about that. It had time.